Alfred Korzybski's famous quote, "The map is not the territory," is one of those observations whose simplicity conceals its reach. He introduced the formulation in 1931 while developing what he called general semantics, an attempt to understand the relationship between reality and the abstractions human beings construct in order to think about it. A useful map bears some structural resemblance to the territory it represents. Otherwise, it could not guide us anywhere. But even the finest map necessarily selects, simplifies, emphasizes, and omits. Confusion begins when we forget the difference. The principle seems obvious when the map is made of paper. No one mistakes the blue line representing a river for water. Yet the distinction becomes much harder to maintain when the maps are made of language. Words such as gravity, intelligence, inflammation, trauma, meridian, chi, homeostasis, and consciousness become so familiar that they begin to feel less like names we have given to patterns and more like things we have discovered lying intact inside nature. Once a concept acquires sufficient explanatory power, we tend to stop seeing through it and begin seeing with it. Medicine provides an unusually vivid example because human beings were observing bodies long before they possessed microscopes, chemistry, electrophysiology, or molecular biology. They knew that wounds became hot and swollen before anyone could describe cytokines. They knew that certain plants relieved pain before anyone had identified receptors. They knew that pressure or stimulation at one part of the body could sometimes alter sensation or function elsewhere before anyone could trace peripheral nerves or describe spinal reflexes. The observation preceded the mechanism. It usually does. Traditional Chinese medicine grew within that world of accumulated observation. Over centuries, practitioners organized recurring experiences into a coherent vocabulary, organs understood partly through function rather than merely anatomy, paired qualities such as yin and yang, patterns of excess and deficiency, channels or meridians linking regions of the body, and qi, a broad concept used to describe movement, transformation, and physiological activity within the system. These ideas were codified, taught, revised, and applied clinically across generations. They were not produced by controlled trials in the modern sense, and centuries of repetition cannot by itself protect an observation from expectancy, selection bias, or inherited error. But neither were these systems arbitrary fantasies assembled without contact with bodies. They were attempts to make a usable map from what practitioners believed they repeatedly saw. Imagine, for example, that generations of practitioners noticed that manipulating particular locations on the skin produces recurring sensations, sometimes extending away from the site of stimulation, and that combinations of such points appear to influence particular classes of symptoms. Those observations immediately present a problem of communication. One needs some way to record which locations seem related, what kind of responses occur, how those responses differ between patients, and how the relationships appear to change with bodily condition. Draw lines between reliably associated locations, name the lines, describe something as moving through them, and an explanatory system begins to form. The system can be enormously useful without its explanation being literally true. A sailor can navigate by speaking of sunrise, even though the sun is not rising around a stationary Earth. A physician can describe a patient as having high blood pressure, without imagining that pressure is an independent substance inhabiting the arteries. A meteorologist can speak of a storm front as though it were an object travelling across the continent, although the front is actually a dynamically changing boundary among enormous interacting masses of air. In each case, language turns relationships into things because things are easier for human cognition to hold. The trouble begins one step later, when the convenience of the noun becomes an ontological commitment. On one side of the argument surrounding traditional medicine, this happens when qi is treated as though it must be a literal substance or previously undiscovered physical energy, and meridian drawings as though they must depict hidden anatomical tubes. If stimulation along a traditional channel produces meaningful effects, The temptation is to say that the channel therefore exists exactly as the explanatory model describes it. On the other side, the same mistake can appear in reverse. If dissection reveals no tube corresponding to the meridian, and physics detects no form of energy corresponding neatly to chi, the observations organized by those ideas may be dismissed with the explanation. The reasoning becomes, if the proposed mechanism is unreal, the relationship it was invented to describe must also be unreal. But those are separate questions. Whether two phenomena are reliably related is an empirical question. Whether changing one reliably alters the other is a stronger empirical question. Why that relationship exists is a further question still. Mechanistic explanation is extraordinarily valuable because it allows relationships to be situated inside a larger causal structure. But the absence of an accepted mechanism does not logically turn a reproducible observation into a coincidence. This distinction has become particularly interesting with the changing scientific understanding of the interstitium. The interstitium is not mystical. It is the extracellular environment occupying spaces among the more familiar structures of the body, containing fluid, extracellular matrix, collagen, signaling molecules, and many kinds of cells. Yet for much of the history of microscopic anatomy, some of its physical organization was surprisingly easy to miss. The reason provides an almost literal illustration of the map territory problem. Traditional histology usually requires tissue to be removed, chemically fixed, dehydrated, sliced very thinly, and mounted on a slide. That procedure produces extraordinarily useful images. It also changes the tissue. In 2018, researchers examining the human bile duct with a technique capable of imaging living tissue noticed a reticular pattern that did not look the way the same tissue appeared on ordinary histological slides. When they investigated further, they found fluid-filled spaces supported by collagen bundles. Under conventional preparation, much of the fluid disappeared, and the spaces collapsed, leaving collagen layers pressed against one another. What had appeared on slides as a relatively dense connective tissue wall had possessed in life an open, fluid-filled architecture. Similar structures were identified in the digestive tract, bladder, skin, tissues surrounding the bronchi, fascia, and connective tissues surrounding arteries and veins. The investigators also demonstrated communication between these spaces and lymphatic drainage. Nothing suddenly appeared in the human body in 2018. What changed was the map. More precisely, the method used to construct the map had previously altered one feature of the territory before representing it. The preparation was not wrong. Histology had revealed an enormous amount about human anatomy. But it had a blind spot. A method optimized to display cellular and structural detail could cause a dynamic fluid space to collapse. Once a different method allowed investigators to look at living tissue in another way, a feature that had been difficult to appreciate became obvious. Subsequent research presented evidence that interstitial spaces could exhibit continuity across tissue and organ boundaries, strengthening the proposal that the interstitium should sometimes be thought of not merely as countless isolated puddles between cells, but as a distributed body-wide environment capable of participating in fluid transport, signaling, and cellular movement. This does not mean that scientists discovered chi. That statement would repeat the original mistake in a modern vocabulary. It becomes tempting precisely because the new anatomical picture sounds unexpectedly familiar. Traditional Chinese descriptions had long spoken of bodily communication through channels, spaces, and pathways involving the movement of qi and other fluids. In March 2026, researchers writing in Frontiers in Physiology explicitly examined this resemblance. They compared the modern concept of an integrated fascial interstitial system with the traditional Sanjiao-Moku system, a set of concepts describing interconnected spaces through which fluids and physiological activity were understood to move. They proposed that the resemblance might offer a testable way of investigating the anatomical basis of some phenomena historically described through meridian theory. Importantly, the paper describes this as an analogy and a hypothesis, not as the discovery that ancient Chinese terminology was secretly naming collagen, hyaluronan, and interstitial fluid. That distinction is the interesting part. Suppose an ancient physician repeatedly encountered patterns of bodily relationship, but lacked any possibility of observing fibroblasts, extracellular matrix, autonomic nerves, inflammatory mediators, or interstitial fluid under a microscope. The practitioner could still observe the behavior of the organism from the outside. Press here, and something changes there. Needle this region, and a characteristic sensation travels along a recognizable path. Certain symptoms tend to occur together. Some interventions work differently when the patient is exhausted, feverish, injured, or emotionally distressed. Patterns accumulate. The resulting model would inevitably be phenomenological. It would describe what the system does before anyone could know what the system is made of. This is not peculiar to ancient medicine. Much of science begins exactly this way. Genetics existed before DNA was identified as the hereditary material. Thermodynamics achieved remarkable predictive success while the microscopic nature of heat remained disputed. Astronomers described planetary regularities long before anyone understood gravitation as we do now. A stable pattern does not have to wait for its mechanism to become observable before it can become useful knowledge. Acupuncture provides an especially tangible example. When an acupuncture needle is inserted and rotated, it does not interact solely with nerve endings. Experimental research has shown that connective tissue can mechanically engage the rotating needle, with collagenous tissue winding around the shaft and transmitting mechanical deformation into the surrounding matrix. That observation led researchers to investigate mechanotransduction, the conversion of mechanical forces into cellular and biochemical responses as one component of acupuncture needling. Again, the mechanistic finding is useful. It tells us something real about what a needle can physically do inside tissue. But notice how quickly a new map invites us to make the same old mistake. Once connective tissue enters the explanation, one can announce that fascia is the meridian system. Once interstitial fluid enters the picture, one can say that interstitial circulation is qi. If neural pathways are demonstrated, someone else can insist that qi is really nerve signaling. Each claim takes a potentially important correspondence and prematurely closes the question by identifying one representation with the phenomenon itself. The organism has no obligation to choose among them. A needle inserted into living tissue may deform collagen, move interstitial fluid, activate mechanosensitive cells, stimulate sensory neurons, alter local blood flow, provoke immune signaling, and produce responses in the spinal cord and brain. These processes do not occupy separate universes merely because modern textbooks assign them to separate chapters. They occur simultaneously in one organism. Perhaps the more productive question is therefore not, what is qi really? Perhaps it is, what class of observations was the concept of qi attempting to organize? That change in question opens the door to a broader understanding. If qi was historically useful as a language for describing patterns of movement, responsiveness, circulation, vitality, and regulation, then discovering that several different physiological processes participate in those patterns does not refute the concept, nor does it prove the concept literally true. It simply offers a new model that makes similar predictions. Likewise, a meridian need not correspond to a single undiscovered tube to contain useful information. A pathway recorded phenomenologically could conceivably reflect the overlapping geography of nerves, connective tissue planes, vascular structures, interstitial spaces, patterns of muscular tension, referred sensation, and central nervous system organization. Some traditional pathways may correspond well to the measurements that scientists are able to make at their desired microscopic scale. Others may not. The mistake is locking into a description because it works in some limited instance. This is where commitment to an explanatory system can become an obstacle even when that system is sophisticated or scientific. A spiritual explanatory system can restrict inquiry by insisting that every observation must ultimately be understood in terms of subtle energies, predetermined correspondences, or inherited doctrine. Contrary evidence can then be absorbed as evidence that the energy was blocked, the diagnosis was incomplete, or the observer insufficiently sensitive. The map becomes insulated from correction. A mechanistic scientific worldview can acquire a parallel limitation if it quietly assumes that only relationships already reducible to familiar mechanisms deserve to be considered real. When observations that do not fit the accepted architecture are labeled coincidence, placebo, noise, or impossibility before their relational structure has been adequately examined, the existing map becomes a filter determining which parts of the territory are permitted to count as territory. The useful middle ground is methodological rather than ideological. Begin with the phenomenon. Describe it as precisely as possible. Under what conditions does it appear? How frequently? How large is the effect? Does it recur across observers? Does changing one condition change another? Does the relationship disappear when expectancy is controlled? Does it depend upon pressure, depth, direction, timing, bodily state, or the combination of several interventions? What other phenomena accompany it? Where does the pattern fail? Only then ask what might account for it. Neural mechanisms can be tested. Fascial mechanisms can be tested. Fluid dynamics can be tested. Expectations and placebo responses can be tested. Historical meridian predictions can be tested. Several explanations may prove simultaneously relevant. Some may explain different portions of the same phenomenon. Some cherished relationships may disappear entirely when examined carefully. The important thing is that observation remains capable of correcting explanation, rather than explanation deciding beforehand what observation is allowed to mean. Thought experiments involving patterns are useful principally in this sense. Rearranging familiar structures into unfamiliar relationships can interrupt habitual perception. Sometimes a speculative correspondence reveals nothing. Sometimes it draws attention to a pattern that can subsequently be checked against anatomy, physiology, or clinical observation. The value lies in becoming able to see it as a possibility, in turn enabling observation and examination. That is also why a correlation between an ancient symbolic system and a modern physiological finding should produce curiosity rather than triumph. If a traditional description and a newly observed biological network overlap, there are many possible explanations. The resemblance might be superficial. It might result from selective interpretation. Both systems might be responding independently to obvious features of human anatomy. The older phenomenological system might have preserved real relationships whose mechanisms were inaccessible to its creators. The mechanisms may also be inaccessible to modern scientific techniques. Only investigation can distinguish among those possibilities. But investigation becomes impossible if either side believes the conclusion has already been dictated by its map. The most interesting lesson of the interstitium may therefore have little to do with proving or disproving qi. It is that the human body contained a widespread anatomical feature whose appearance changed dramatically according to how scientists prepared tissue for observation. The old histological picture was enormously productive but incomplete. The newer picture is also productive, but it too will be incomplete. Our instruments reveal reality by interacting with it. Our categories divide what the organism itself does not necessarily divide. Our explanations emphasize particular causal scales while leaving others indistinct. Traditional Chinese medicine constructed one kind of map from centuries of externally observable relationships. Modern biomedicine constructs another from anatomy, imaging, biochemistry, electrophysiology, statistics, and increasingly fine measurements of internal processes. The modern map has powers of resolution, testing, and prediction unavailable to its predecessors. That makes it a better map for many purposes. It does not transform it into the territory. Nor does the antiquity of the older map make it sacred. Some roads drawn on it may lead nowhere. Others may have been distorted through centuries of copying. Some may represent metaphor rather than physiology. But occasionally, an old line may cross a feature that a newer map has only recently learned to display. When that happens, the appropriate response is neither the ancients knew everything, nor, now science has finally explained away the superstition. It is something quieter and more demanding. There appears to be a relationship here. Let us see how far it goes. That position requires a peculiar intellectual discipline, because explanatory systems provide psychological comfort. They convert uncertainty into nouns. Once we can say qi is stagnation, sympathetic activation, fascial restriction, or interstitial flow, the naming itself can feel like understanding. Yet each expression selects one view of a process whose complete organization may exceed the scale at which the explanation operates. The territory remains the living event, pressure becoming sensation, sensation becoming reflex, mechanical strain, altering cells, cells altering chemistry, chemistry altering circulation, circulation altering tissue, expectation altering perception, perception altering muscular tone, each process feeding into others faster than our disciplinary boundaries can keep them separate. The maps are indispensable because without abstraction there can be no accumulated knowledge at all. We should improve them relentlessly. We should discard maps that repeatedly mislead us and prefer those that predict the territory more accurately. But their highest purpose is not to replace reality with an explanation. It is to help us notice relationships within reality that we might otherwise fail to see. And perhaps that is the deeper significance of Korzybski's warning. The danger is not merely that an ancient practitioner might mistake qi for a substance, or that a modern researcher might mistake a mechanism for a complete explanation. The danger is the more universal human desire to believe that once we possess a coherent description, the world itself has become coherent in precisely the same way. It has not. There is always more territory than